The sun was setting over the small town, casting long shadows across the quiet street. Emma sat on the porch, her hands wrapped around a warm cup of tea. The silence was heavy, filled with thoughts she wasn't ready to face. It had been like this for weeks. The distance between them seemed to grow with every passing day. What had once been a home full of warmth and love now felt cold, empty, as if some invisible wall had quietly risen between them. She had been waiting for the moment when they would finally confront the truth. But the longer it took, the more terrifying it became. Her mind wandered to their early days together. The first time they met felt like it had happened in another life, before everything had changed. She could still remember how his eyes had locked onto hers across the crowded coffee shop, a spark that had ignited a feeling in her she hadn't known she was missing. But now, even though he was sitting just a few feet away, the spark was gone. There was a growing emptiness inside her that neither of them had been able to fill. A secret she was holding, one that had begun to overshadow everything they once shared. Her husband Mark was still inside, pacing the kitchen, his mind running through the same thoughts as hers. They had been married for almost 5 years, a beautiful wedding, a quiet honeymoon, and the promise of forever, or so they had thought. But somewhere along the way, things had shifted. Emma had become a stranger to him, just as he had become a stranger to her. The words she had been holding inside for so long were finally bubbling to the surface. She hadn't known how to tell him, when to tell him, or if she even should. There had been so many moments when she'd thought about confessing, but the fear of what it might do to their relationship kept her quiet. The sound of the door creaking open broke her reverie. Mark stepped out, his eyes meeting hers. He was different now, too. His once easy smile had turned into a forced curve of his lips, a mask hiding his confusion and hurt. "Emma, we need to talk," he said, his voice softer than usual. She nodded but didn't speak. Her throat felt tight, as though something was lodged there, preventing her from saying anything. "You've been distant," he continued, sitting down beside her, "and I've been trying to understand why. I need to know what's going on." She couldn't bring herself to meet his gaze. The secret she was carrying felt like it was suffocating her, and each word he spoke made it harder to breathe. "I don't know how to say it," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Mark leaned forward, concern in his eyes. "You don't have to say it all at once. Just tell me what's been going on." Emma's heart pounded in her chest. The storm of emotions she had been holding back for so long threatened to break free. But she wasn't sure if she was ready to face it yet. Later that night, after dinner, Emma found herself standing in the kitchen. The soft hum of the refrigerator, the only sound breaking the silence. Mark had gone to bed early, but Emma couldn't bring herself to sleep. Her thoughts kept racing, and the weight of her secret felt like it was crushing her. She had always prided herself on being strong, on keeping her emotions in check. But now, everything seemed out of control. What was happening to her? Why couldn't she let go of the fear, the guilt, and the shame that had taken root in her heart? The truth was, she had been hiding something from Mark for a long time, something she hadn't even been able to admit to herself. Her mind flashed back to the moment when she had first realized it, when everything inside her had changed. It had been a slow process, subtle at first. She had always been an empathetic person, one who could understand other people's pain. But one day, she found herself struggling to hide her own. She had fallen into a spiral of self-doubt, questioning her choices, her marriage, her life. And then, she had met someone. It had started innocently enough, just a few conversations here and there, a shared look, a moment of understanding. But it had turned into something more, something she couldn't control. Emma closed her eyes, willing herself to breathe. How could she have let it go this far? How could she have betrayed the man she loved so deeply, the man who had stood by her through everything? But it was more than just betrayal. It was fear. Fear of losing herself, of becoming something she wasn't, of forgetting who she had been before everything had gotten so complicated. Her hand reached out, resting on the cool surface of the kitchen counter as she tried to steady herself. She didn't know if she was ready to confront the truth, and even if she was, would Mark ever forgive her? The next morning, as the sun began to rise, Emma stood by the window, staring out at the quiet street. The world outside was just beginning to wake up, but inside, everything felt still, frozen in time. It was then that she knew it was time. She couldn't keep running from the truth anymore. She had to face it, and she had to face him. The decision to confess, to finally tell Mark the truth, wasn't going to be easy, but it was the only way forward. She turned away from the window and walked slowly down the hall toward the bedroom. Mark was sitting on the bed, his back to her, his posture rigid, as though he were bracing for something. "Mark," Emma said, her voice a little stronger now, though still trembling with uncertainty. "I need to tell you something." Mark looked up, his eyes filled with both concern and a faint trace of fear. "What is it, Emma?" She took a deep breath, her hands trembling at her sides. "I've been hiding something from you, and I don't want to anymore." The words hung in the air between them, unspoken but powerful. Mark's gaze softened, but his lips remained pressed together in a tight line. "Tell me," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. And so, she did. She told him everything, the conversations, the emotions she had buried deep inside, and the fears that had driven her to make the choices she had. She didn't expect him to forgive her immediately, but she needed him to understand. Mark didn't speak for a long time. The silence between them was deafening, but it was a silence filled with the weight of everything they had shared over the years. The good, the bad, and the things neither of them had ever dared to say. Finally, Mark stood up and walked toward her. His expression was unreadable, and Emma's heart sank. "I don't know what to say," he whispered. Emma's throat tightened. "I'm sorry. I never meant for this to happen. I just didn't know how to deal with it." Mark reached out, taking her hand gently in his. "I don't know either, Emma, but we'll figure this out together." The following days were filled with quiet moments of introspection and understanding. Mark and Emma didn't have all the answers, but they were learning how to navigate the mess they had found themselves in. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't always pretty, but there was a sense of peace that began to settle between them. They began to open up to each other in ways they hadn't before. The conversations were slow, deliberate, but each word was like a small step forward. They learned to be patient with one another, to listen without judgment, and to love despite the pain they had caused each other. By the time the next week rolled around, Emma felt something shift within her. It wasn't that everything was perfect, or that the weight of her guilt had disappeared, but there was a sense of relief in knowing that they were facing it together. The healing wasn't instantaneous, but it was real. As Emma sat by the window one evening, watching the stars twinkle softly in the sky, she thought about everything that had happened. The fear, the shame, the doubt it had all been so overwhelming. But now, with Mark sitting beside her, a quiet peace settled over her. Sometimes, she whispered to herself, the hardest thing is learning to love yourself, but it's worth it. Thanks for watching at English Stories Unfolded. We hope you enjoyed today's story. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more inspiring tales that help you learn English. See you in the next story.